Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger, and I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks and co-chair of Literature Berks. On behalf of our entire committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of programs. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and Sinking Spring Public Library and the Jewish Book Council. In the chat, you'll see a link to purchase a signed copy of Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, a true as told to me story through our official book vendor, Reads and Company Bookshop. Literature Works is happy to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. Remember that books always make great gifts. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type any questions you may have into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer questions throughout the program. Bess Kalb is an Emmy-nominated writer for Jimmy Kimmel Live. Her writing for the show earned her a Writers Guild Award in 2016. She's also written for the Oscars and the Emmys. She's a regular contributor to the New Yorker's Daily Shouts. Her work has been published in the New Republic, Grantland, Salon.com, Wired, The Nation, and elsewhere. I am honored to welcome Bess Kalb to Literature Berks.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you to everybody for joining us, and I'm so looking forward to our Q&A. It's just it's great to be a part of any event that's bringing people together over books, and I'm so happy that the Jewish Federation is leading the charge. And thank you to those of you who are joining us from isolation today. I'm glad that we could all virtually be here together.
So why don't you just tell us a little bit about the background of this book? What led you to write this story?
So the book Nobody Will Tell You This But Me is the story of my grandmother's life told in her words from beyond the grave. And what led me to write it was her death. I was very, very close with my grandmother. We were best friends in that we spoke every day on the phone. If one of us didn't hear from the other person, we'd think there was a disaster, and my mom would get involved. One of us would find each other, and we were close our entire lives. Those of you who read it know the litany of that. When she died, it was my job to deliver her eulogy at her funeral, to give one of the eulogies at her funeral, and I couldn't do it. The words that I had written seemed like they were falling short. They weren't really summarizing her life or paying tribute to her in the way that really did her justice. And I remember writing draft after draft on my computer in my notebook, just trying to summarize my grandmother's life while in the depths of grief. This was just a day after she died. And in that grief-stricken writer's block, I figured out that the best way to pay tribute to my grandmother was to let her do it and to let her words speak for themselves. And so I went up there in front of my relatives, in front of my grandmother's grieving husband and my grandfather, my heartbroken relatives with my own broken heart. And I read one of her voicemails to me. And as I read this voicemail, and for those of you who read the book, you might remember the story. It was the story about how when I was a little girl, my grandmother would walk me to nursery school and then sit outside my nursery school classroom for the whole first week of school. Anytime I knocked at the door, she would pop her head into the little window in the door and give me a smile and a wave and tell me it was okay. And then I'd go back and play with the other kids. And this went on for a week. And it was a voicemail that she left me about basically saying, like, do you know how much I've done for you? Do you know what the sacrifices that I'm willing to make for you? And I the voicemail ended with a long pause, as many of them did, as she got her agenda out there and said, move back to New York by the end of the year. And so she gave me this story of, look at the mountains I've moved for you, look at the hell you put me through, and then the follow-up, which is what she's really saying. And as I delivered this, I looked at the audience, and those people who I described, those heartbroken people, were all laughing. And they were looking at each other with recognition, and they felt something that was akin to her being there. And that's what doing her voice did. And when I saw that, when I looked into the audience, excuse me, I knew that I really had something, that I had a way to channel my grandma in a way that broke through the toughest possible room. And I also felt, not just as a granddaughter, but as a writer, I felt energized. I felt like, oh God, the skill that I have writing is something that I do. It's the only thing that I can do. I can use it to bring my grandma back. And so, as a personal project, as like this cathartic grieving tool, I just started writing as my grandma. I started writing her life stories and the stories of our life together. And I was sharing these posts just with family. Excuse me. Excuse me. Just with we have two cats, so I'm very allergic to. Um, and was sharing these, and eventually realized that I had 45 pages written, and maybe there's a book in there. And lo and behold, there was. And those 45 pages of grief-stricken writing that I did right after my grandma's death, right after her eulogy, are the first 45 pages of Nobody Will Tell You This But Me.
That's amazing. It had such a unique structure to it because it's coming from your grandmother's voice. And I'll be perfectly honest, I first started reading it and I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't line up. Like I thought you were, I thought it was going to come from your voice and then it was your grandmother's voice. So I thought it was just such a unique way. But can you talk about how you really weave, it's not just your grandmother's story, it's really, multiple generations of women in your family and their stories.
Yes. This I couldn't tell my grandmother's story or the story of our relationship without weaving those matriarchs into the fabric of it. In trying to unpack why my grandmother and I had such a special relationship, why our love was so strong, I really had to examine her relationship with her own mother and with her daughter, my mom. So oh, here comes my water delivery person. Okay. It's Charlie, for those of you who read the book. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Spoiler alert, we got married. The boyfriend in the book is now bringing me the water on Zoom webinars. But what a fairy tale. But that's better. So the relationship between my grandmother and her mother was so different than the type of love that she gave me, and the relationship with her daughter was so different than the type of love that she gave me. And so I had to really sort of go back and say, okay, how could this person who had such a difficult relationship with her mother and her daughter have this relationship with me where we were so close? And the answer was this: I was a do-over. And I wrote this book as a way to not show this perfect grandmother, but as a way to show how a person who's shaped by relationships that aren't necessarily as loving is the wrong word, but as affectionate, as demonstrative about love, how that can really shape somebody into a grandmother who can't help but aggressively and fiercely love. So all of those stories ended up coming together to make sense of our story together.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's so true for so many families,
Yeah,
that the mother almost gets caught in between because it's like you didn't treat
totally.
me like this, and
Totally.
suddenly like the granddaughter, my kid gets treated like so amazingly.
Yes. That's how it is with my son too. I mean, not that my mom and I have a very close relationship, but the level of like toys and the showering of things, I was like, where was this when I was a kid? You know?
How did when you first started writing, what was your family's reaction? Like your grandfather, your mother, like your extended, I assume you have cousins. Like, what did everyone else think about it? Was there some jealousy there or questions about doing it?
Not to my face. My grandfather and mother were extremely helpful. Those were the two people who were involved in this. Other people in my family aren't mentioned in the book. They have their own stories with my grandmother and their own relationships, and those are sacred and for them to tell. This is really just a matrilineal. It's the story of the only daughter of an only daughter of an only daughter, and it really just focuses on that. On that line, on that lineage. And so, in talking to the surviving members of that line and talking to my mother, and then the person who bore witness to my grandmother the most, her husband, my grandfather, they were so helpful with helping piece that with cobbling that together for me. I have hours and hours of interviews with my mom and a couple hours of interviews with my grandfather saved as files in my iTunes, getting the details about events that I was not alive for. Things that predated me and things that happened when I was very young. But the stories in the book about Georgie and Leo, about my grandfather's business, about, um, the Mexico story, pink milk, all of these things came from my mom. And it ended up being the act of writing this book ended up really being a great way to connect with my mom and to sift through family history together to make sense of this woman who shaped both of our lives so profoundly. So it was a good family therapy exercise and according to the New York Times, a good book.
That's awesome. Why don't you tell us like one of your favorite Bobby stories?
My favorite Bobby story. It changes every day. I think about her every day. I think about her, because I have a child now and I don't know how to do anything without her, let alone have a child without her. And so the story that there's so many stories that aren't in the book. And it was so hard to sort of figure out what made sense for the specific tale. But the one that is in the book that is my favorite story of her, um, is the. I mean, I'm really deciding between two, but I think it's really about a story that didn't involve me at all. It's something that happened with my mother. It's when my mom was traveling back from the kibbutz in Israel, to the United States. She kind of never made it to the halfway point. She never made it to her friend's house, apartment in Paris, where her friend was an au pair. And that's where she was going to check in with my grandma and call before she went to the States. And she was delayed. My grandma didn't hear from her for it was something like 8 hours beyond when my mom said that she would call. That's a ton of, like, trains could get delayed, anything could happen. There's no real reason for my grandma to assume there was a crisis, except every Jewish mother on this call is like, there's a crisis. My grandma did an extraordinary thing where she had always told my mother, if you get sick abroad, you go to the American hospital. And so my grandma at 4 in the morning, having not heard from her daughter that night, her daughter who could have been like partying in Europe, having a time, Mrs. forgot to call her mother, who she didn't call very often at all. My grandmother called the American hospital in Paris and said, Robin Bell's room. And they said, just a moment. And my grandmother then woke my grandfather up, hit him with a pillow, and was like, you said not to worry. And went to JFK Airport, and paid cash to sit in the stewardess's flip down seat in the galley on that next flight to Paris, the flight that was sold out for probably days, the summer, and from the one flight from New York to Paris. My grandma sat in the galley the whole time and made it to my mother's bedside. And that to me, that's like a whole movie. And that's just one story from my grandmother's life. And to me, it shows this is somebody um, who worrying sometimes pays off, and trust your instincts. And when your daughter is in jeopardy, you sit in a galley if you have to. You get to her bedside.
Yeah, you do whatever you need to do.
You do
Absolutely. If
whatever you
anyone has questions for Bess, please feel free to put them, excuse me, into the Q&A. One of the other aspects of the book that I just found fascinating was it really seemed like a quintessential immigrant or just American story. Maybe you want to talk about how your great grandmother, like some of those stories with your great grandmother to like your experiences just seemed like completely night and day. It's just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, my great grandmother was essentially a refugee. My great grandmother fled the pogroms, like many Jews in America. I came from somebody who fled persecution for a better life. It's all of our stories. And the story of my great grandmother Rose, is an extraordinary story that's also very, very common. This is something that happened to an entire generation of Jewish immigrants, but there isn't really a well documented history. And there really isn't a lot of, in talking to my friends who have great grandparents who made similar journeys, this wasn't really part of family lore. People didn't talk about the old country or talk about the journey. It was sort of, get here and you make your life. And relationships with kids were much different then. We're not like, let's process it as a family and like, talk through our emotions and how does that make you feel? It was just sort of like, here's your porridge, and like, go get a job. And that's essentially how my grandmother was raised. Hence the book's worth of love that she poured into me. But she, Rose had a harrowing journey. When she was 12 years old, she came to the United States from her shtetl in Pinsk in Belarus under the Pale of Settlement. She came to America alone. And that's an impossible thing to do. I've said before, I wasn't allowed to take the subway at that age, which is sort of like a funny thing to say, but it's absolutely true. It's dangerous for a 12-year-old girl to travel anywhere alone, let alone across a continent and through checkpoints, escaping Tsarist Russia. It was an impossible thing to do, but she did it. And I have this stack of books here that I've showed before, but why not? It's so the benefit of having a book talk in my office, to figure out what it must have taken for a 12-year-old girl, 12 going on 13, to get, she was 13 when she got here, to get to the United States. I had to go to the books. And shamefully, I was not taught shtetl history in school. I didn't know what it was like in Tsarist Pinsk, even though it's my origin story. And so, fortunately, this book called Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, is the subtitle. And it's by Alyssa Ben, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Ben Porad. It's a translated text, and it ends up being it was an indispensable handbook to me for figuring out what life was like in the region that my great grandmother lived. The Jews of Eastern Europe, by Israel Bartal. This is the translated book. Is a book that explained, well, persecution of Jews didn't just happen in the pogroms and the Tsar's army charging through villages. It happened in laws that were passed after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, when rumors started spreading that the Jews did it. All of a sudden, reading the Talmud was illegal in school. So they basically outlawed Jewish literacy, and kosher meat had 50% tax attached to it. So eating was illegal. They're starving Jews out. There were all of these oppressive systems that existed for this 12-year-old, where it made sense for a mother to look at her and say, you have to go if you want to live. And so reading these books helped illuminate that. And then I had the Atlas of Jewish History. When I'm writing an escape story, how do you traverse the map of Europe, from a landlocked shtetl to the port city of Hamburg, where steamships went to the United States? There were no ships at the time that my grandmother emigrated from Odessa. I wish there were a straight line just to go from Russia to the United States, but to escape via steamships, she had to go through forwarding stations in this sort of epic odyssey through Europe, where other Jews hid her, house by house, and got her onto trains and helped shepherd her to the sea, where she was able to get on a boat and then make an even more dangerous journey in this boat alone, to the United States. And so I went to the texts, I went to history, and I also had a sort of a fascinating weekend reading congressional testimony from Italian immigrants around the exact same time, who, in trying to advocate for rights of immigrants on steamships, testified about the horrible conditions that people in steerage had. And the people in steerage were Italians and Jews most of the time. And so they spoke about, these Italian immigrants said, and by the way, there's no kosher food. So a lot of these people are starving for 12 days and trading biscuits. And so reading that testimony helped. A depressing weekend where I was not very fun at dinner. I was like, do you know that they had troughs like pigs? And my husband was like, okay, great. I'm not hungry anymore. But so really going to the history and figuring that out ended up helping me write a personal family story, but it's supposed to stand for everybody's family story. That this was not something that was specific to Rose. This is something that Jews in America and Israel and London and various diaspora places where Jews ended up from fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. This is where we came from. And so Rose's story, even though I think it's something like a 20-page thing in the book was a huge part of the research that went into writing this, because it's so important to represent it accurately and in a way that other people can see their own families and their own histories in it. And so I was trying to use it as a way to be representative of so many people, with Rose as the sort of focal point.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Did you have an interest in history before you got started on this project?
Not really. I mean, I wasn't very good at math, so as a default, I guess history was a class that I didn't dread. But I'm not somebody who sort of like gets caught in the footnotes, and I'm not a historian. I relied on historians to to get me there, to help. Like, I'm a writer, to help flesh out this sort of writerly idea of what her life must have been like. But I think as a relatively political person, and as somebody who's following the news, I think history ends up being such a valuable teacher to us. And in reading about persecution, and persecution of Jews and persecution of immigrants, I couldn't help but be fascinated through today's lens, and taking the suffering of my ancestors and Rose to heart, something that gave me sort of a keen interest in history, because as we all know, if we don't learn it, we are doomed to repeat it. And so I took this historical lesson pretty seriously for that reason.
We have a couple questions from the audience. Joan wants to know if you can provide an example or two of what your grandmother told you that nobody else would tell you.
Sure. I mean, it's such a throwaway line in the book, even though it completely defines our relationship. The way that she said it in the book was, Bessie, you'd be gorgeous if you went a little blonder, which is such and she prefaced it with, nobody will tell you this but me. You'd be gorgeous if you went a little blonder, which is just such a grandmother thing to say. What an insult! What a directive! Um, and untrue. I don't think I would look good blonde. I'm very, very pale. But um, the real nobody will tell you this but me. Those real, the whole book is something that nobody would tell me about her. It's her life story. So, I mean, one example that with the chutzpah that the sort of original line came from, was that I was going to marry this guy Charlie, who who I'd been seeing at the time for like 3 months, and it's in the book. She said, she was sort of making grand plans. I was telling her my plans for Christmas break. I was saying I was going to his family in Maine, and they celebrate Christmas, and I'm sorry, I'm dating a non-Jew, and it's a nightmare, but what are you gonna do? And she just sort of flatly said, oh, well, my brother married a Catholic woman, and when he brought her home, and I think she was like 8 months pregnant at the time they had been dating, and my mother from the shtetl gave one look at her and gave her a bear hug and said, "Welcome to my home." And so that's what I'll do with Charlie. And I was like, I am just dating this guy. We are also in college, so basically what dating means is like we will get coffee with each other occasionally and like complain about each other's theses. Like, this is not like yeah, I'm his girlfriend, I guess. So I'm going, like, we have a vacation time from school, so I will spend it together, and he has to be at his family. Like, don't read into it. And she was just like, "You're getting married," and this is
Now he gets you water on Zoom.
on my Zoom while he entertains our child in the other room. So nobody would tell me that but my grandmother, and she was absolutely right.
Charlene says, thank you for sharing your stories. You are right. It's great being a grandchild and then being a grandmother. Will you write a book about your grandfather?
I mean, my grandfather's book would be like a John le Carré spy thriller. It would be so much fun. He should write it. He is the best storyteller in the family and has so many of them. I am writing another book. It is not about my grandfather, but I know that my grandfather is still here to tell his story, and I will take every opportunity I get to hear it from him. So it's not my job to write his story right now. It's his job to keep telling it.
I love that. Rachel wants to know, when did you realize that you loved to write or just had to write for a career?
Um, you know, that's actually I always knew that I wanted to be a writer. I in this like corny way. I remember seeing the movie Little Women when I was really young, and there was a scene, the original Little Women, the better one. No, that's not true. Oh my God, this is being recorded. They're both amazing, but the one that was like my childhood one, and Winona Ryder played a writer in it, and she had and this is such a silly thing to admit, but she was talking to this man who held her hand, and she said, I'm a writer. And he said, I know your hands are covered in ink. And so I, as a first grader, would put pen marks on my hand, like just in case I met the love of my life. And he would know I was a writer. So I like putting pen marks on like on my fingertips, like delicately. I knew I was a writer, but I also wrote all the time. I wrote terrible poems that rhymed snow with Eskimo. I wrote and wrote and wrote. It was something that I did to amuse myself, and I did constantly. And so there was sort of no other thing that I could do, and so out of lack of skill, that was my option. So that's the true answer. That's all I can do.
Nancy wants to know also about your writing that you write comedy. Was humor common in your family? I would say, having read the book, Bobby is hilarious. So I'm going to say yes, but maybe that's
So
just.
yeah, you're totally right, Amanda. I mean, I am the straight person in this book. My grandma has the funny lines. Like I'm just sort of like reacting in like there are like many times in the book where the answer to one of her jokes is just silence. Like she was a spitfire and also so shrewd and smart that she could have been like a Joan Rivers style like roast comic on the road if she wanted, but she was not like she didn't crave the stage. She was just doing it to rib on her friends and mostly on me. But she's so funny. And I think in families, there is a sort of internal comedic language that happens. Like you laugh together and it only makes sense in your family. And that's definitely a way that I lived growing up. I also had two parents with really tough, hard jobs and where that dealt in human suffering. They're both doctors in really intense situations. And my mom dealt with they're both retired now. They're both professional grandparents now. But and photographers, wonderful photographers. But my mom was a psychiatrist. My dad worked in an intensive care unit, and so they were dealing with people really in crisis. And so it was my job growing up to break the ice. Um, and so that is, if you want a recipe for a comedian, have just like two people who have stared in the face of death all day come home across the dinner table, and you have to be like, egg rolls, there's no eggs in them. And I think I just had a hilarious insight, and they're just like, this 7-year-old thinks she has shtick, and we are laughing at her. And so that is how my comedic instinct kicked in.
Nice. I love that. What do you think your grandma would have to say about 2020?
I think she would say what her Zader told her and what she told me so many times throughout her life. There's a saying in this book, it's a refrain that gets repeated a lot and was said to me as a kid, as an adult. I would sometimes roll my eyes at it because I knew it as I took it for granted at times. I dismissed it, but it is so important and it is exactly applicable to now. And she would tell me, Bessie, my Zader used to say, when the earth is cracking behind your feet and you feel like the whole world is going to swallow you up, you put one foot in front of the other and you go forward. And that's her attitude. That's how she lived. That's how she was, and that's how she taught me to live. And so, she would look at this horrible time and absolutely, with the firm resolve she always had, put one foot in front of the other. And she would also make sure to not let herself go, and she would put on her lipstick every day. She would do things that I certainly haven't. But I think she would put one foot in front of the other, and she would remember to make her bed and put on a nice blouse occasionally.
I love that. I felt like in the book you really got to know Bobby. And when you were describing as she was passing,
Yeah.
as she was dying, it really was like in such a Bobby way. Like she didn't want to talk about it. You know what I mean? Like she just, like
Yeah.
you said, she kind of put one foot in front of the other. And then like, it just, I don't know. I just felt like it was such a, like, not that there's a good or bad way to die, but that was a good way to die. You know, like she felt like, I felt like she was okay with it and that she was like, this is the way I'm going to do it. And that's how she did it.
Yeah, it's as only she could. It's why the book is in her voice. It's not let me tell you about my grandmother. It's let my grandmother tell you about me. Because that's, even in death, even in with the various indignities and struggles of old age, she was somebody who didn't put it on other people. But that's not necessarily like feel free to like share your I wish she had been more open with me about what was troubling her, but because of this relationship that we had, because she was the grandmother, she ended up just being herself until the very end to me, and that's what was very important to her, to maintain who she was until the very very end. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That came through. Jan wants to know what your next book is about.
So my next book, by the way, when I was writing this book and people would say like, what are you writing? I would be like, writing a book about my grandma, and I guess it's sort of like a ghost autobiography. And so people were like, there, that's nice. Like nobody will read that. And so like they sound crazy. Um, I am somebody who writes more comfortably in the voice of other people. And so inhabiting a character is really important and letting them tell their story and like present their case and make their agendas, whether it's a comedian on television or my grandma. So the next book is also through the voice of a very opinionated, very, very young woman who is discussing which is also based on a true event of um, a suburban murder. And so that is the next book, and we'll see how it shapes up. But it's very fun to write in the perspective of somebody who I know very well, and also am very very different from now.
That sounds super interesting. I'm so curious now. Another question, how different is it to write comedy skits for a TV show versus writing an article versus writing a book? Any of them harder, easier, more
You know,
enjoyable?
you always have a deadline and an assignment, and so you do your assignment for the deadline. And I I found that this book was really enjoyable to write. Of all of the projects that I've had, this was such a personal thing for me, and it was such a way to connect with my grandma. And so it didn't feel like a writing assignment. It felt like this excuse I had to connect with her. And so I would say this was the most enjoyable, even though my husband would be like, "Are you kidding me? You were a mess and crying all the time." Because like I remember like when the book came, I was like, "Oh, this was such a joy to write," and he was like, "Ha ha ha," and I was like, "No, what are you talking about?" And he was like, I would walk. He would walk into my office, and I would be like the net, and he's like, "Okay." So even though it brought up a lot of emotions and was at times painful to revisit, especially in some of the later chapters, the harder moments to reckon with, to discuss death and to discuss suffering and pain and loss. That was very difficult, but it was such a joy to relive the best moments of our life together and of my grandmother's life as a mother and as a wife, that this didn't feel like any other writing assignment I had, and it was by far the most fulfilling time I've had as a writer, was writing this.
That's great. Deb wants to know who reads the audiobook.
I do. You're looking at her.
That's awesome. Did you get the choice, or that was something that you really wanted to do?
I did, but they all made me. I kept saying like, have an actress do it, and because I had read so much of the book over the phone to my editor, and I was like, okay, well, what do you think about this? And I would go into it, and she's like, Bobby's voice is your voice. And I also feel like nobody can inhabit her voice but me. Like I wouldn't entrust a stranger to do it necessarily, because I know I know her cadence. I know the way she spoke,
Yeah.
and it was written, each sentence was written so vocally. This reads like somebody talking to you. And
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I wanted to keep it in her voice as much as I could. And so I tried to do her justice in the audiobook.
That's awesome. I had a question, I just forgot it. What books for fun have you read this year that you loved?
Oh my God. Well, I have a 15-month-old baby, so eat, sleep, poop. The new basics of the sleep training
The
book.
sleep
That
training
is,
book, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Taking care of babies, which I paid something like $200 for an online sleep training thing, which was made me so nervous that I then lost sleep over how much money I had paid for. But the books that I read for pleasure this year, Samantha Irby's "Wow, No, Thank You" is so funny. It's such a funny book. She's a great essayist and comic. Mike Birbiglia and Jen Stein's book called The New One was such a beautiful. They're a husband and wife. He's a comedian, she's a poet, and they wrote a book about their daughter, about their baby, and what it was like to transform into new parents. And it is so funny and so beautiful. Mike also had a one-man show on Broadway called The New One, which is an adaptation of the book. And I really recommend that one. There's almost no non-cliche way to talk about parenthood. He figured it out, and it's really heartfelt. Um, I Books that I loved. Something That May Shock and Discredit You by Daniel Ortberg, an amazing personal memoir about a trans experience, and I found that to be really illuminating and about something that I knew nothing about, and feel very close to him for now. I read Margaret, but I was like 2 weeks postpartum. I don't know if this counts as this year, but I read the new Margaret Atwood book. And I don't recommend like breastfeeding and sitting in a chair reading
Yeah,
that, but I think it's called The Testaments,
yeah,
or
yeah.
yeah.
Definitely.
I read that one on Kindle, so I don't have like the feel of it. But I just, you know, devoured that one. She's a master. Those are some
Similar
books.
question. Growing up, who were your favorite authors or favorite books?
At different stages of my life. So my first favorite book was Little Women. Was Louise May Alcott's Little Women. I quote that book, and I loved it. I Mrs. Dalloway was the book that made me want to be a writer. When I read that in high school, it was like a light went on. I didn't know that like prose could be like that, or she, that was one of the books that made me want to be a writer. And then in college, Joan Didion's Slouching Toward Bethlehem was the book that made me know I could never be a writer. Um, um, because she is a master, and um, I to this day, like anytime I'm right, I'm like, well, she would she not like this? Is this not precise enough? Does this hold up? I hold myself to her gold standard. So those are probably the books that have been the most formative for me as a writer. But um, yeah, Mrs. Dalloway, Little Women, and Slouching Toward Bethlehem.
Thank you. Does anybody have any last minute questions? I'm curious about your father's side of the family. Did you have close relationships with your grandparents from your
I
childhood?
I do. I was on the phone with him and FaceTime for an hour and a half today. And it was a joy. My grandma Judy deserves not only a book, but an opera, a musical called Judaism. And she lives in New Jersey. She is the queen of New Jersey. And she is the best woman currently alive. Judy Kalb and Morty Kalb they're so important to me. And when my son was, I think, like 4 weeks old, they flew out from the East Coast to LA. They're having great grandparents is so important. That he has three living great grandparents is such a blessing. And I thank God for all three of my grandparents, Hank, Judy, and Morty. all the time. I'm so grateful for them. And it was tough writing it. You memorialize one grandmother in this book. I keep trying to tell my grandma Judy the truth, which is this is not the story of a perfect person. The book that I wrote is not this sort of chicken soup for the grandmother soul. My grandmother comes across as very, very flawed in it, and the mistakes that she made with her daughter are profound. It wasn't all flying to Paris. There was essentially a poisoning that happened. That's a big chapter of the book. Accidental, but this is to just because I'm memorializing one grandmother doesn't mean I don't deeply, deeply love and cherish the other. So I'm very close with my dad's side as well.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed the book. I highly recommend you read it. Our local libraries have copies, but you can also purchase a copy. I'll put it back in the chat. Oh, I sent it to the panelists. Let me send it to the attendees. There you go. It's in the chat. Thank you so much, Bess, for joining us. Our next literature event is for Hanukkah. It's called the Ninth Night of Hanukkah with Erica Pearl on December 19th, and we hope you can join us. Take care.
Thank you,